We'll call the meeting back to order, and I apologize. We've never had this happen with the electricity went out, but the computer is flickering, but the C-SPAN is working, so we're being recorded again as according to the rules. Where we left off, Mr. Palmer had 3 minutes remaining, so I now yield 3 minutes to Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's try this again. According to Twitter, the decision to ban President Trump was after a close review of his tweets and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter. On June 3rd, 2018, the Iranian Ayatollah Khomeini tweeted, "Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor in the West Asian region and has to be removed and eradicated. It is possible and it will happen." This tweet remains on Twitter to this day. Mr. Roth, how do you believe this tweet from the leader of Iran calling for the eradication of Israel was received and interpreted on and off Twitter?
I couldn't say for sure how that tweet was interpreted.
You would have a pretty good idea, though, of how many retweets and the amount of traffic it got.
Only from what I can see in that illustration.
Why does the Iranian leader who has explicitly pledged to eradicate the Jewish state of Israel get to remain on Twitter? Mr. Roth.
Like all of Twitter's users, the Ayatollah is subject to the same set of rules. And while I can't speak for Twitter's decisions today, I can say that Twitter took a number of enforcement actions against the Ayatollah's account, the same way that we would against
That's still
else's.
up. You understand how hypocritical this is, right? You banned a sitting U.S. president and a sitting member of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, while a man who has pledged death to America and can openly call for the death of millions of Jewish people and yet not be removed from Twitter. You understand how that looks? How hypocritical that is? I'm asking Mr. Baker, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth, Ms. Navarro. That's amazing. But it shows hypocrisy at Twitter. I want to pivot here, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman made a very troubling statement claiming that as Vice President Joe Biden fired the Attorney General of Ukraine, since he had knowledge of this prior to becoming a member of Congress, Mr. Goldman should provide to the committee documentation about this action. We should know who authorized Vice President Biden to take this action against the Ukrainian Attorney General. We need to know, was there an investigation to justify the firing of the Ukrainian Attorney General, and if yes, who conducted it? He needs to provide all details involving this action, including Vice President Biden's threat to withhold $1 billion of U.S. funding if the Ukrainian AG was not fired, and who authorized Vice President Biden to make that threat. I would request that the committee look into this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been an incredibly electric hearing. It'd be funny if it weren't real life. I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to be victims so very badly. But Ms. Navaroli, if I understand you correctly, public criticism and allegations of anti-conservative bias are actually making Twitter and other social media companies less willing to enforce their own policies against political conservatives, correct?
Yes, that was my understanding based on research that was done at Twitter.
Meaning the same Republicans insisting on making themselves a victim is working?
Could you repeat the question?
The same Republicans, folks on this panel, who are insisting on making themselves victims in this conversation about Twitter censorship and other accusations they've made, is this working because of the conservative bias and the implications of it? Or the allegations of conservative bias? In other words, are the allegations of conservative bias making it harder for those in Twitter or those who are working there to enforce these policies against folks who incite hate speech or make it?
Thank you for rephrasing that question, and thank you for asking it. Yes, these allegations are very much having an impact on the leadership within every social media company as they hope to not receive allegations of being biased or in any way being politically leaning.
Thank you. I'm not the only lawyer in the room. So you all know that while the Constitution does provide us the right to free speech, there are, of course, limitations. As Ms. Navaroli pointed out, we cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Compromising freedom of speech may seem dangerous until we weigh that compromise against the men and women massacred in Buffalo, for instance, or the many other places where radicalized violent extremists found their motivation to kill on social media. This isn't about oppression. It's about public safety. This isn't about censorship. It's about protecting our democracy from misinformation. Ms. Navaroli, it was your job to decide whether someone was yelling fire in the theater. Could you describe the coded incitement to violence policy Twitter did not implement?
Yes, thank you for that question. The coded incitement to violence policy was an incredibly nuanced policy that was created in order to fill the gaps that were existing in the already existing policies around violence. The policies around violence were explicit. So these were calls that said, I'm going to, I want to, I plan to, I wish to. Those sorts of incitements would have come down. Things like stand back, stand by. Things like I am locked and loaded and ready for a civil war were dog whistles that were not covered underneath the policy.
Thank you. Could it have saved lives if it were implemented on January 5th, 2021, or possibly in November of 2020?
I can't speculate as to what might have happened, and I do wish we would have acted.
Thank you. Ms. Gaddy, the very same words that were plastered across Twitter were shouted at the January 6th insurrection. What threats do Americans face now that Elon Musk has removed all guardrails and welcomed back Donald Trump to the platform?
Thank you for the question. I'm actually not really familiar with what the content moderation policies of Twitter are today.
Okay, thank you. Social media platforms like Twitter must own up to their responsibility in spreading violence and chaos. I'd argue so too do members of this panel and institution. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roth, I want to go back to the whole question of your finding hundreds of thousands of fake accounts set up by Vladimir Putin and the Russian Internet Research Agency, I think they called it, which was the propaganda arm in 2016, and I suppose to this day. Some have been suggesting on the other side of the aisle that it's illegitimate for the FBI or any representative of the federal government, presumably even Donald Trump, who did a lot of this, to contact private media entities in order to apprise them of anything, whether it might be the penetration of organized crime or child pornography or foreign malign influence. And I'm just wondering if you would give us a sense of how much work is actually being done, and I was going to check with you and Mr. Baker about that. How much work does Twitter and other social media entities do that relies on the FBI and other national security agencies?
Thank you for the question. There is a considerable amount of work to address foreign disinformation at Twitter and also at other companies. And this work was reliant in part on intelligence shared with companies by law enforcement and by the intelligence community. I would regard that work as essential. At Twitter, we had dozens of people working just on these questions of election interference. Those teams no longer exist under Mr. Musk.
And Mr. Baker, if you could.
Thank you, sir. Just generally, I mean, it's a matter of public record that the FBI has worked with the public, including private entities, for decades. Indeed, they've had for some number of years now an office of, I think it's called Office of Public Sector Engagement. This is part of what they do in order to fulfill their responsibilities and to do their jobs to protect the country.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. I'm going to continue down that line of questioning. So when you testified, you were just talking about working very hard to keep foreign troll farms from using Twitter and to engage in malign foreign interference. This sounds like a fairly robust undertaking. You said between 2016 and 2020, you had different teams stood up to do this. Constant vigilance?
Yes, sir. That was the phrase that we used.
Yeah. And these types of attempts are constantly evolving. They're trying to find new ways to penetrate your system, so you have to be engaging with it on and being willing to adapt on a constant basis.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And now we forward to 2020, and earlier you had testified that you were having regular interactions with national intelligence, Homeland Security, and the FBI?
Yes, I did.
And primarily to deal with foreign interference?
Primarily, but I would
Also
say almost
misinformation and all of that.
exclusively.
But you had said earlier, like your contact with Agent Chang was primarily with foreign interference?
Yes, that's right.
All right. And these were emails, were there meetings?
Yes, Twitter met quarterly with the FBI Foreign Interference Task Force, and we had those meetings running for a number of years to share information about malign foreign interference.
Agents from Homeland Security or intelligence, or just primarily the FBI?
Our primary contacts were with the FBI, and in those quarterly meetings, they were, I believe, exclusively with FBI personnel.
And you had multiple former FBI agents on the payroll. I mean, Mr. Baker, you have 10 years experience with FBI, DOJ?
I was, well, with DOJ, it's 2 decades roughly, but I was, just for the record, I was never an FBI agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Twitter has such a close relationship with at least one FBI agent that that agent could start emails with, hey, Twitter folks, and could actually advise your company about violations of your own terms of service. Mr. Roth, I think it's safe to say that you had a consistent dialogue with the FBI for the weeks and months prior to the New York Post. Is that fair?
I had ongoing conversations with the FBI for years, I would say, about election security.
And in response to Mr. Fry earlier, you said you would not categorize the FBI communications as pressure.
No, I would not.
However, Twitter's director of policy wrote to you in 2020 that Twitter has seen a sustained effort by the intelligence community to push Twitter and that Twitter should keep a solid front against these efforts. He specifically cited Elvis Chan, an FBI agent in San Francisco. Now, on August 11, 2020, Agent Chan sent you 3 documents in prep for a meeting and said the documents pertain to APT-28, a hacking unit connected with Russian military intelligence. Agent Chan arranged for having security clearance for Mr. Baker and facilitated encrypted networks for the FBI to share information with Twitter employees. And on October 14th of 2020, you stated that this feels a lot like somewhat of a subtle leak operation. Earlier today, you testified that you were following national experts on Twitter, national security experts on Twitter, as a reason to take down the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop.
Yes, sir, I did.
So, after 2016, you set up all these teams to deal with Russian interference, foreign interference. You're having regular meetings with the FBI. You have connections with all of these different government agencies, and you didn't reach out to them once?
Is that question in reference to the day of the New York Post
Yeah.
article? That's right. We generally did not reach out to the FBI to consult on content moderation decisions, especially where they related to domestic activity. It's not that we wouldn't have liked that information. We certainly would have. It's that I don't believe it would have been appropriate for us to consult with the FBI.
In December of 2020, you did a declaration to the Federal Election Commission that the intelligence community expected a leak and a hack operation involving Hunter Biden. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg confirmed that the FBI warned Meta that there was a high effort of Russian propaganda, including language specific enough to fit the Hunter laptop Biden security story. You're talking to these people for weeks and months, years prior to this leaking. They have specifically told you in October that there is going to be a leak potentially involving Hunter Biden's laptop. They legitimately and literally prophesized what happened. And you didn't contact any of them?
No, sir, I did not.
Did they reach out to you?
On and around that day, to the best of my recollection, no, they did not.
So after the story was taken down and you guys did it and you personally disagreed with it, Ms. Gaddy, you said you did. Did you contact them and say, hey, is this what you were talking about?
If that question was directed to me, no, I did
Ms.
not.
Gaddy, did you talk to anybody from the FBI?
Not to the best of my recollection.
So I guess my question is, what is the point of this program? You have constant communication. They're set up for foreign interference. They've legitimately warned you about this very specific thing, and then all of a sudden everybody just walks away? Like, this is what you planned for. This is what you prepared for. This is the information. They told you exactly what was going to happen, and then you want, I don't care if it's members of Congress, you legitimately want the American people to believe we just completely cut off contact with all of the people who we were supposed to defend against? I don't think it passes the smell test, and neither do the American people. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Casar for 5 minutes.
I'm honored to be a new member of Congress, where our purpose is to listen to the people and represent their voices and lift up our communities. After talking to thousands of people across Texas, asking them, What do you want me to work on for you as a new member of Congress? Not a single person told me they were concerned about a New York Post story on Twitter about Hunter Biden. Is that really what we're dedicating this committee's time to? Is that really what we're going to dedicate the next 2 years to? Our constituents of all political backgrounds are worried they're getting pushed out of their neighborhoods by spiking housing costs. They see their public schools suffering because we aren't supporting our teachers. In my state, our rural hospitals are closing. We have more uninsured people than anywhere in the country. We have the highest number of food insecure kids, and reproductive rights have been stripped away. We're talking about none of that. It seems to me that we're having these hearings so that people can beat their chest about Hunter Biden, maybe do some fundraising, get some headlines, and ironically post those on Twitter. If that's what House Republicans want to spend their time on, then that's their prerogative. But to me, it's a damn shame. We're here for a bigger purpose than that. Under the leadership of the legendary chairman, Jack Brooks from Texas, this committee implemented the Great Society through the creation of Head Start and the creation of Medicare. They investigated Watergate. They built the U.S. space program. Anything is possible if we all come together to work on what our constituents demand, if we make sure that we say to our constituents that your voice matters here. We could be ensuring that the historic investments in infrastructure and domestic manufacturing create good union jobs where we need them the most. We could take on free speech and civil liberties issues at home and across the world. We could be investigating and taking a look at these real threats of domestic terrorism and civil unrest. We could be making sure that our constituents' lives are better. But instead, we're focusing today on Twitter. The American people deserve better. I yield back my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casar. Let's go back to this point about the Russian disinformation campaign. And just to refresh everybody's recollection, Mr. Roth,